Imagine you are standing in complete darkness. The air is wet stone and rot, and something else, something human that you cannot name. Above you, the city roars, crowds cheering, vendors shouting, children laughing. Life, loud and brutal and oblivious. And here, beneath all of it, buried alive in the belly of Rome's most feared prison, a woman screams. And no one hears her. No one is meant to. What happened to women who fell into the hands of Rome's justice system, or worse, those who had no justice system at all, is one of the darkest, most suppressed chapters of the ancient world. Not because historians didn't know, but because for centuries, no one thought it was worth telling. Until now. This is not a comfortable story. This is not a story of marble columns, and philosophical debates, and glorious conquests. This is what happened in the shadows of all that glory. This is what Rome did not put on its monuments. This is what they buried, sometimes literally, along with the women themselves. Welcome to Empire of Shadows. Rome, at its peak, a city of over 1 million souls, the greatest empire the Western world had ever seen. And like all great empires, it ran not just on ambition, and military genius, it ran on fear. On absolute, carefully engineered terror. And nowhere was that terror more total, more suffocating, more deliberate than the treatment of those the Roman state decided were no longer worth protecting. Women in ancient Rome existed in a legal gray zone that is almost impossible to grasp. From a modern perspective, they were not citizens in the full sense. They could not vote, could not hold office, could not represent themselves in court without a male guardian. A woman's legal identity was, in many ways, entirely dependent on the men around her father, her husband, her son. When those men disappeared, when she was widowed, abandoned, enslaved, conquered, or simply accused, she fell into a void, and in that void, Rome had prepared something. To understand the fate of female prisoners, you need to understand one fundamental truth about Roman society. The treatment of a woman in captivity was almost never about justice. It was about power. It was about sending a message. And the message was always the same. You do not matter, and we can do whatever we want. Let's begin at the very bottom. The Tullianum. The Tullianum was Rome's oldest, and most infamous prison. It sat at the foot of the Capitoline Hill, wedged between the Forum and the Temple District, so that citizens going about their daily business buying bread, visiting temples, watching senators pass were always within a few dozen meters of its entrance. This was not accidental. Rome wanted you to know it was there. Rome wanted you to feel it. The structure itself was modest from the outside, just a small, unremarkable building with a hole in the floor. That hole led down into a lower chamber carved from the living rock. No windows, no light, barely enough air to breathe. Historians who have physically entered this space describe it as one of the most psychologically crushing environments imaginable, even today, 2,000 years later, even knowing you can leave. The prisoners kept down there could not leave. Now here is what most people don't know. The Tullianum was not primarily designed as a long-term holding facility. Rome didn't believe in long prison sentences the way we do. The Romans believed in resolution swift, decisive, often fatal. The Tullianum was, in practical terms, a waiting room for death. You went in, you waited, and then, one day, why? The men came down with a rope, or a blade, or simply let you starve in the dark, and it was over. Women entered this place. Not often, but they entered it. And the records, sparse as they are, hint at stories that would never make it into the official histories. One of the most haunting accounts involves the followers of the Bacchanalian Bon, a religious movement that Rome crushed with extraordinary violence in 1866 BC. The Senate, convinced that Bacchic worship was a front for conspiracy, sedition, and moral corruption, launched a systematic persecution that swept up thousands of people across Italy. Many of them were women. The women who were accused of initiating crimes defined loosely and applied broadly were handed over to their male relatives to be executed privately, in secret, so that Rome would not have to be seen doing it publicly. Let that sink in for a moment. The state was so anxious about the optics of executing women that it outsourced the killing to their own families. Fathers killing daughters, husbands killing wives, not because they wanted to, because if they didn't, the state would take them too. And those who had no male relatives, those women went to he magistrates directly. What happened to them is recorded in only the vaguest terms. dealt with, one source says. Appropriately punished, says another. Rome had a gift for making inconvenient things disappear into the language of bureaucracy. But the Tullianum and its darkness were only one corner of a much larger world. Because most female prisoners in Rome were not political prisoners. Most of them were something the Roman state found simultaneously more useful and more disposable. Slaves. Slavery in Rome was not a monolithic institution. It existed on a spectrum of brutality that could range from a life of relative comfort in a wealthy household to something that defies easy description in modern language. And female slaves who were accused of crimes or simply accused, full stop. Because accusation was often enough, entered a legal position where they had almost no recourse whatsoever. A free Roman woman accused of a crime had certain protections, weak ones, dependent on male guardianship, but protections nonetheless. She could theoretically appeal. She could have a representative speak for her. An enslaved woman had nothing. She was property, and Roman law was explicit. The testimony of an enslaved person was only considered valid in court if it was extracted under torture. Under torture. This was not a loophole or an abuse of the system. This was the system. Officially, legally, written into the law of the most sophisticated legal civilization the ancient world produced. If you were enslaved, and you were called to testify whether you were a witness, a victim, or the accused, your words only counted if someone had hurt you badly enough while you said them. The logic, such as it was, went like this. Slaves were so loyal to their masters, so fundamentally compromised by the relationship of bondage, that only extreme physical coercion could liberate the truth from them. Except the truth that came out under torture was, of course, whatever the torturer wanted to hear. And everyone with any intelligence knew this. And they did it anyway, because it was never really about the truth. Now let us talk about something that the ancient sources approach only in whispers, in euphemisms, in careful sidesteps that make you realize how fully the men who wrote history understood what they were describing and how completely they chose to look away. Roman law, contained a provision that stated, explicitly, that a woman condemned to death could not be executed if she was a virgin. The reason given was religious. There was something spiritually impermissible, some violation of sacred law, about killing a virgin. So what happened when a condemned woman was a virgin? The executioner was instructed to violate her first. This is not conjecture. This is not conjecture. This is not interpretation. The Roman historian Suetonius records this practice in his account of the Emperor Tiberius, describing how girls too young for execution under the traditional law were dealt with before being sent to their deaths. Tacitus confirms it. The practice was known. It was formal. It was a procedure. For a moment, set aside the horror of what this means morally, and just look at what it reveals structurally. Rome had built the violation of women directly into its legal code. It had bureaucratized it, made it a step in a process, given it a legal justification so thin, so transparently obscene, that you have to wonder what the men who wrote it thought when they went home afterward. Whether they thought at all. This was not the action of monsters operating outside the law. This was the law. And then there were the arenas. When most people think of Roman gladiatorial combat, they picture men, muscular, armored, dramatically lit by the Mediterranean sun. And mostly, they are right. Gladiatorial combat was a masculine institution in its conception and its mythology. But Rome's appetite for spectacle was not limited by gender, and the arena was, in its darkest applications, an equal opportunity theater of death. Female prisoners, particularly those condemned for serious crimes, or those captured from conquered peoples, could be, and were sent to the arena, not usually as gladiators in the traditional sense, though female gladiators did exist, and are documented. More often, condemned women were used in the venatio, the wild beast hunts, or in the staged mythological executions that became fashionable in the imperial period. These mythological executions were perhaps the most theatrically depraved thing Rome ever produced. The concept was simple. Take a myth involving death, usually violent and often sexual, and stage it with a real human being as the victim. Criminals and prisoners, men and women both, were costumed as mythological characters, and then killed in the first, ways meant to reenact the story. Nero was particularly fond of this. Domitian too. Women condemned for adultery, a crime that could be broadly, and conveniently applied could find themselves in the arena, dressed in the costume of a goddess or a nymph, performing an involuntary death for the entertainment of 50,000 people who had come for a day out with their families. The crowd ate figs and watched. There is a name history has preserved, barely, almost accidentally: Epicori. She was a freedwoman, a former slave who had been emancipated, and she became involved in the Pisonian conspiracy of 65 AD, the most serious plot against the Emperor Nero's life that we know of. When the conspiracy was discovered, the arrests came fast and brutal, and Epicurus, who had been detained separately some months before the main plot collapsed, found herself in the hands of Nero's investigators. What followed was described by Tacitus with a kind of grim astonishment that you can feel even across 2,000 years of translation. They tortured her, systematically, searching for names, for details, for anything she might know. She gave them nothing. Not one name, not one piece of info. Sure. Rationing that could be used against another person. Tacitus himself, who was not a sentimental writer, records this with visible respect, noting that she held up better than the freeborn Roman men who broke almost immediately, and gave up everyone they knew. The next day, they brought her in again. She could barely move. She was being carried, and so she fashioned a noose from her own breastband, hung it from the arm of the chair she was being transported in, and killed herself rather than give them another chance at her. Rome had not managed to break her, so she left, on her own terms, in the only way available. Tacitus calls it a remarkable example to set. He means it, and you can hear, behind his careful Latin, something like shame. Beyond the drama of conspiracies and arenas, there was the quieter, more pervasive horror of what we might call institutional captivity. When Rome conquered a territory, Carthage, Judea, Dacia, Britain, the aftermath was not just political subjugation. It was mass enslavement. Hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes millions over the course of Rome's history, were dragged from their homes and marched in chains back toward Italy, or distributed through the provinces. Women were among them. Always. These women who had been queens, priestesses, mothers, farmers, merchants, all of it erased in an afternoon, entered a slave market, where their fates were determined by a single currency: their perceived usefulness. Young, healthy, attractive women commanded prices that reflected what Rome considered their primary value. The records are blunt about what that value was. What is less often discussed is what happened after the initial sale. Because slavery in Rome was not static. Enslaved people could be resold, rented, used as loan collateral, inherited, gifted. A woman could pass through 5 or 10 or 20 owners in the course of a lifetime, with no ability to refuse, no ability to appeal, and no legal mechanism whatsoever to protect her from any of them. The Roman jurists in Rome had brilliant jurists, men who thought deeply about law and society, and the nature of human rights occasionally wrestled with this. There are records of legal debates about whether an owner could be held responsible for the death of a slave who died under excessive punishment. The answer was generally no, unless the death was so public and serious. Oh, grotesque that it caused a disturbance. The threshold was not moral. It was social. Don't make a scene. That was roughly the standard. There is one more story that Empire of Shadows cannot leave untold. The Vestal Virgins were Rome's most sacred women. Chosen in childhood, sworn to 30 years of chastity and religious service, they tended the eternal flame of the goddess Vesta in the heart of the Forum. They had extraordinary privileges: the right to free slaves with a touch, immunity from assault, a seat of honor at public games, legal independence so extraordinary that even Rome's most powerful men treated them with careful respect, and they were subject to a punishment so specific, so elaborately constructed, that it stands as perhaps the most chilling intersection of religion and state violence in the ancient world. If a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow of chastity, whether guilty or not, because the accusation itself was often political, the punishment was live burial. She was brought in a covered litter, so that no one could hear her cries, through the streets of Rome to a place outside the city called the Campus Celeratus, the field of wickedness. There, all underground chamber had been prepared. It contained a lamp, a small amount of food, some water, a bed, just enough so that Rome could tell itself it had not technically killed her. It had simply placed her somewhere. The entrance was sealed with earth, and Rome went back to its business. The lamp would go out when the air ran out. Or she would starve, or she would simply be entombed alive, In the dark, beneath the same city she had served her entire life, listening to the sounds of people walking on the ground above her until the sounds stopped meaning anything. This happened not once, not twice. Multiple Vestals were buried this way. Their names are recorded. Opimia, Floronia, Marcia, Licinia, Emilia. The list goes on. Some were certainly guilty. Some were almost certainly not condemned during moments of political crisis, when the Romans needed a religious explanation for a military disaster, and a woman's burial seemed like an adequate offering to the gods. They were sacrificed to the story Rome needed to tell about itself. What strikes you, when you spend time in these histories, is not just the brutality, it is the architecture of it. Rome was not a chaotic place. Rome, sure. Was obsessively organized. Its cruelties were designed, codified, given official names and legal frameworks, and procedural steps. The horror was bureaucratic, and that is somehow worse than if it had been wild, because a wild cruelty suggests passion, suggests a moment of human failure. But a bureaucratic cruelty suggests something else entirely. It suggests that everyone involved sat down, thought it through, wrote it up, assigned it a place in the legal code, and went home to dinner. The women in this story, the ones whose names we know, and the overwhelming multitude, whose names we will never know, lived and suffered inside that system. Some of them, like Epicharis, found a way to resist it, even at the ultimate cost. Most of them had no such option. Most of them simply endured, or did not endure, in the dark, in the stone, in the arenas, in the legal categories that Rome had constructed to contain them. History remembers the emperors. It remembers the generals. It remembers the generals. It remembers the senators debating in marble halls with their fine words about liberty and law. Empire of Shadows remembers the others. If this darkness found you, if you sat with this story and felt something shift, sure, in your understanding of what civilization can mean and what it can hide, then you know why this channel exists. Because the most important history is not the history that gets carved into monuments. It is the history that gets buried, and we will keep digging. Subscribe, because the shadows have more stories to tell, and some of them are far worse than this one.